what's the need around VUCA? We actually realized that the last thing most of us need actually is more information. That this new world, like let's go back to the old world, the one that we were raised in. Information, it was a problem space of scarcity. Like it was, how do you find information? And then how do you go about acquiring that information? But we've really shifted into a different problem space with information. It's actually a problem space of abundance. There's tons of information coming at us. And so I think it requires, I mean, this is my hypothesis, I think it requires a different skill set. So it's like, it's almost like there's a book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, but if you can eat anything and it's all available to you, how do you know what to eat? Like, what do you put on your plate? What do you take in? And then how do you digest it? Like, how do you break it down into meaningful chunks and assimilate what you need to and let go of what's no longer serving you? So really what we're giving today is more of a framework so that people can try to connect dots and to slot information in. So like when things are coming at you, it's a way to slot in information. And then we're gonna point you, we're not gonna spend a lot of time actually, but just we wanna point you towards what I call transformative technologies, but ways to like start practicing and embodying the skills for this new world.
Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And as you already know, obviously it's a term that's used to describe the conditions that we're living in. We're going to focus for a few minutes on the first one, on volatility. And because volatility obviously means change and turbulence. And a lot of us, I think, are experiencing that in our personal lives as well as in the world, a lot of change. Obviously, some of you mentioned it in your check-in. So it's not only in our own personal lives, but in the systems that we see around us. We're seeing breakdown, you could call it, you know, where the old systems no longer work, right? So we're going to dive more deeply into all of this later in the class, but to start, we're going to look at breakdown, the first one, volatility. So we're going to do that by practicing a form of conscious communication called the way of counsel. We're going to do a mini version of that together and a little bit adapted for this setting. The origins of counsel, just as a little bit of context and background, is not owned by any particular culture. It's owned by all of us. It's really just about being human beings together and changing the conversation slightly so that it's not how we might usually just talk back and forth in a discussion. Imagine a time when we would have been sitting around a fire at night, just long time ago, imagine. And sitting around that fire would have been the place that we would share stories. It's where we would gather information about our survival. Where is the food? Where are the dangers? We would celebrate moments, key moments in our lives. And as we would see the glow of the fire in each other's faces, that's how we would navigate our way through the darkness. So if you could, for a moment, just imagine that we're sitting in a circle instead of in these little boxes in a line, and that we can equally see each other's faces with the glow of that fire. So the intentions for counsel are pretty straightforward. Wait, before I tell you those, I kind of want to, well, I'll tell you, you can leave that slide up, but you can leave the intentions up. But to give you where these intentions came from, counsel is practiced all over the world. It's used in the Middle East for peace talks between Palestine and Israel. It's used in prisons. It's used in organizations like Snapchat and Xerox. And it's used in schools. And that's really where it gained the most traction in the mainstream, was in the schools in California in particular, at the Ojai Foundation. And it was the children in the classrooms using counsel that came up with these intentions, because they didn't have much time. They had to squeeze counsel in between classes and all the other things of their day. So they came up with these 5 intentions. So one is to listen from the heart. And so that means when someone's speaking, you don't interrupt or think about what you're going to say. You're just really trying to listen as best you can. And you don't have to respond to someone. The second one is to speak from the heart. Again, you don't have to plan what you're going to say. You're just speaking what comes to you, which leads to the third one, which is be spontaneous, which can be hard sometimes to practice, just saying what's coming through. Be succinct and lean, mindful of the time so that everybody gets a turn, and confidentiality. So anything that's shared in this circle stays in the circle. Of course, it's recorded, but I think that's with permission for our own class academy group, just to keep that in mind. But it's never posted publicly, anything that you share, obviously. And some of the breakouts won't be recorded either anyway, just the main room.
This is the framework that we talked about. And before we start, I just want to make a disclaimer. A map is never the territory. And that there's another quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I just hope that you find this, it's a framework, it's not reality, but it's a way to understand our current context that has been helpful to me and Bernadette. So I would just tag here that she and I partnered on this because we both came to this through separate doorways. Okay. I arrived at this framework through an observation and inquiry. And basically my observation is the earth and its inhabitants are hurting at the hands of humans. Like it's not something that's happening to us. We're doing it to ourselves and each other. And yet, despite our best intentions to do things differently, business as usual remains locked in. Hang on. Which led me to two questions. Like, why does meaningful change remain so elusive? And then the other question for me is like, how might humanity's power, which I think is tremendous, it's currently locked up in conflict. How can we free it to navigate VUCA conditions and heal our worlds? I have a story about this framework that I want to just like surface for you guys. Like, I believe that this is something that wants to be seen. Like, I think it's actually like, I think tapping on different people's shoulders. Like Bernadette, it tapped on her shoulder a while ago. It's been tapping on mine for a while. Greg Hendrick isn't here, but I would want to name him as someone else who's using this framework too, or parts of this framework. I entered this through theory, and I'm trying to get more grounded in practice, which is why Bernadette and I are like a cross-functional team. We come with different strengths. And I lean on her and Greg to help ground me. And I would just want to name them both as very powerful guides in how to ground this theory and to practice, because this is theory, it's a hypothesis that I'm kind of working with. Okay, so basically, why this framework, why now? One of my favorite quotes is, her name is Dr. Laureen O'Hara from the International Futures Forum, and she just names this problem so beautifully. But she basically says that psychologically, we were raised in a world that no longer really exists. Solid ground, we know what's happening. You know, we find ourselves in a new world, and we need a new psychology for this world. But the problem is, how does this new psychology develop when all of our institutions tasked with creating consciousness, think of schools, organizations, all of them are set back in the 19th and 20th century. So the need to develop this new consciousness is huge. And it grows even more so because if we think, I don't know if you guys know this, but we think change is extreme now. Some people suggest that we're only 1% into change, and we're at the tip of a J curve, like the change is actually going like this, and we're actually only at the tip of it. So the conditions are actually only going to get more extreme. So this new consciousness is really important. Okay, to understand this framework, like one of the fundamental things to understand is that humans have a profound need for order in our lives. And over the history of time, we've created two strategies for meeting this need. One was to exert, and this is DHOC's word. I don't know if you guys know DHOC from Chaotic Organizations. Yay, okay. And also the Art of Hosting community uses this framework a lot. But so here's order. one way to get order is through control. And so like the image I have is like building, to me, life is water. VUCA is water. It's, you know, water is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous. And so one way to deal with water is to build a dock over it. And then the other way is to kind of just be in it and allow it to, allow order to emerge, which is this space over here. I just want to make sure that I'm giving you all the points of this. Okay, so despite our best efforts to control life, many of our social structures and institutions are breaking down in the turbulence of VUCA, and we're finding ourselves in the midst of these waters. So what might we need in order to navigate these conditions? So this is the framework that we're talking about. This is a picture of it. But basically, it's a kayak image. And so it's a awareness of context, which if you know the Kinevin model, it really speaks to context awareness. Another element that we're going to talk about is self-leadership. And then a third element is that we actually have two operating systems and to get really clear and in choice about them. And then there's another element, which is understanding wholes, but we don't have time to do it today. So I'm just tagging it for all of us. Okay, so context. Personally, I never looked at context before 2016. And back then I was really intent on changing the education system. And as I was doing it and finding how very hard it is to change a system that I care so much about, I enlisted the help of mentors. I get an incredible team of people from systems thinking, complexity theory, change theory. And I'm like, come on guys, help me change the system. And they forever changed the way how I see the world. And so I describe the world that I used to live in as red, and the world that I'm trying to live more and more into as purple, because this new world incorporates this old world, but it also transcends it. So red is in purple, but something else is mixed in. And context is a subject that's really dear to me because, and I'm looking at my notes because this is so dear to me, because people are meaning-making creatures. When something's happening and it's related to context, but we don't see the context, we try to make sense by saying, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? And we like either absorb the blame and the burden of what's going on in the system and we put it on ourselves, there's something wrong with me, or we turn the finger, and that's pointing the finger at ourselves, what's wrong with me? Or we point our finger at somebody else and say, what's wrong with you? And there's a lot of conflict that's going on in the world, either internally or between each other. But meanwhile, when we do this, because we're missing the context, we're allowing business as usual, BAU stands for business as usual, but we're allowing business as usual to continue in the structures around us. So I feel really strongly about the need to understand context. Okay, so let's talk about the context of VUCA. And just a quick check-in, is the pacing of this feeling okay? Like moving forward enough, but right size enough? Everybody okay? Hang on, I don't see all of you, so let me just scroll for 1 second. Do a check-in. Everybody's
I
okay?
can look for you if you want.
Oh, would you look for me? Thank you, Bernadette.
I can see.
All right, so then let me get back to focus here then. Okay, hang on. So, and Bernadette mentioned this before, but so VUCA is a military acronym. The notion was first talked about in 1987, but it still hasn't really reached the mainstream. But it's basically, for me, I love it because it names the thing that we're all saying, what in the world is happening to our world? And now we have a name for it. And one thing that I want to just clarify here is that what we said before, life, VUCA is life. And I just want to remind us that like we come from a long line of ancestry that knows how to deal with these conditions. No matter what your background is, like we have ancestors who lived understanding the VUCA nature of life. It isn't until more recently in our ancestry that we really begin to think that we can control VUCA, that we can build a bridge, a dock over it. So to me, it's not so much about scurrying to learn new things. It's actually about relaxing in and remembering what we know deep in our hearts. Okay. So let me just, I want to break down VUCA for you a little bit. There's really two things to understand about VUCA. What's different about VUCA now? So let me just say, what I think is different about VUCA now is one thing is all our efforts to control change aren't working. If anything, they're actually exacerbating it. So this is really about change and the volatility of change, the extreme nature of change. So why is VUCA and why is change getting so much more extreme? So for one thing, we live in a globally interconnected world, and the pace of change is picking up. So like a metaphor that I use, I don't know if anyone plays the game of tennis, but just think about someone throwing a ball at you from far away. And in the past, they were throwing a ball. Now think about all of a sudden there's like 100 people over there throwing balls at you. Like that's what's happening. We're so much more connected, and all these balls are coming at us. And in some of the stories that came up, a ball that's affecting somebody else all of a sudden is in my space, and it's affecting me. So the first thing to know is that the pace of change is actually getting faster. And we'll talk more about that in a minute later. But the second thing is, and this is a DHOC term, but it's called change float. And what change float is, it's the space for adapting. And so going back to the metaphor of people throwing balls at you, think about I'm thinking about tennis, but if you're up close, if I'm up close to the net and you're up close to the net, like I don't see the balls coming at me. It's like boom, 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 boom. Versus if you're further away from me, there's a lot of time for me to see that ball coming and for me to get ready to catch that ball. So like, I just want to draw this out for you. In the past, change looked like this, and now it looks like that. And I'll give you an example. Futurist James Burke talked about, think about the spread of information. In the Iron Age, it took centuries for that information to spread across a single continent. Fast forward into the age of ships, it took years for information from what was known here to spread to other places in the world. Fast forward to when we put a man on the moon, that was seen in 1.4 seconds, which is hopelessly slow by today's standards. But you can just see it went from the spread of and the time to adapt went from centuries to years to seconds to now it's just like instantaneous. So the space for adapting is getting smaller at a time when the need for adapting is getting larger. We live in a time of great change, which is asking us to change greatly. And I really like this quote from Kagan and Leahy out of Harvard, but they talk about that the experience of change is not just a story about the world, it's also a story about people. That basically we're experiencing a mismatch between the complexity of the world and our inner complexity. And we experience this mismatch as overwhelm, as a sensation of being in over our heads, as no matter how hard we're swimming, we're falling further and further behind. I'm giving you this picture, it's the same concept, it's just looking at it from a different angle. But what this shows like human progress and this shows over time. And this is our internal capacity to adapt and manage. And this is, the blue line is our external capacity to change our environment. Humans are amazing at changing our environments. So throughout history, we discovered fire, we invented the wheel, we developed agriculture, and that set major changes in motion that we then, as people and as a society, needed to adapt and learn how to manage. And together they were following a linear line. But there was an inflection point that no one's really talking about. Salim Ismail from Exponential Organizations and Singularity University is the person who speaks so well to this. But there was a shift this line of our external capacity actually took a doubling, an exponential trajectory, whereas our internal capacity to adapt and manage to change is staying linear. And so the pain point, that feeling of overwhelm, is that's this. And you can see that as time goes on, if we just keep developing linearly, the rift is only going to get bigger and more uncomfortable. Is this making sense to people so far? Just a little check-in. Is everybody okay? I'm almost done. You're probably halfway through almost. Okay.
And Laureen, I just want to let people know that we're leaving ample time at the end, like 20 minutes for reflections and questions. So if questions are coming up, please make a note for yourself somewhere, and you will have a chance to share and talk and explore, okay? So hold on to that for now. Thanks.
And thank you for saying that. Thank you. Okay. All right, let me catch up with myself. Okay, so the context is really important because it asks us, what time is it in the world? And that begets the question, how do we become the types of humans our world is calling for? And I love these questions. They're not mine. They're Terry Patton's, who wrote a new book, The New Republic of the Heart.
Sorry, hang on. I have a question from someone that they're wondering if we're meant to be seeing the slides. Can everyone see the slides that Laureen is showing? Thumbs up. Okay, Julian cannot. And everyone else can, it looks like. So Julian, yes, you're meant to be seeing the slides. Are you on your phone? Yes. The screen might just be too small or something. But we also had a request to share the slides afterwards, so we will do that. So it's probably kind of hard to follow, Julian, but I think you'll still get something, and we're going to be doing more interaction and stuff. So hang in there with us. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a one-way directed stream, and I understand that, and it's time limited, so almost done. And sorry you're not seeing this with us, Julian.
Okay.
Okay. Is it okay to continue, everybody, including Julian? You're okay if I continue?
Yep, everyone's nodding yes.
Okay, so that question, like, what types of humans do we need to become, really takes us into the second part of this element, which is the self-leadership, which is really tied to the two operating systems, and you'll just see how that they're just very interrelated. Okay, self-leadership, here we are. So as the structures that we've created over life begin to break down, and we find ourselves like going into the water, the question is, what's left holding us? And it's so funny, Bernadette, when we did our grounding exercise before, my first answer was, we can swim, and I wanted to point that out to us. But Bernadette, in that exercise, you reminded me that water, we can also be held by water. And when we talk about water as life, I just want to name that here, if that meant something to me. All right, so basically what we get to choose, we may not be able to control what's going on outside us, but what we can do is choose. We can control our reaction to it and come into choice, to come into consciousness and choice around how we respond to the changes in our worlds. Like, one way or the other, let's face it, we're moving smack into the water. Like, it's unavoidable. So you can either like ignore what you're seeing, like kind of if you know the Knevin model, it's really about staying in the obvious mode and just kind of being complacent, in which case you tip into chaos, or you can kind of move into an operating space of complexity, develop your swimming muscles there, and then dive into the water. Because it is, and Pierre, like, I don't want to call you out, but like, you kind of, I heard this glimmer, but like, there's something fun about this. Like, woo, it's a little crazy ride and stuff, but like, wait a second, there's possibility here, and I can sense that. So that's what I heard there. Okay. So let me just point out, these are two very different spaces to operate from. And hang on. Self-leadership, what we're talking about here, is really about shifting from automaticity. We've been handed a lot of scripts and shoulds about who we should be and how we should move through the world, and into a place of more improv. Like, throw out that script and start improvising. And to do that, like, you really need to know yourself, and you need to know the context, and you need to know the people around you, and starting to improvise and follow your bliss. So it's a decision that we make to move beyond business as usual and to start innovating new ways of being within ourselves and with each other and working together. And I just want to name this space where we operate from, like 1 and 2 that we're kind of seeing. I'm setting up a left and a right. Otto Schwarmer calls this the blind spot of our time. And he puts it down here. It is the bottom. Does anyone know this? So this is from Otto Schwarmer from Theory U, but it's the iceberg model that basically we see symptoms above the waterline and we don't understand what's holding them in place. But underneath there's tons of structures and paradigms and thought. But at the very, very bottom of it, it's the source, like where each of us is operating from as individuals and as organizations. Where are we operating from? And he points out that little attention is given to our inner space. So Mira, I mean, you talked about meditation earlier, but like cultivating that inner space, this is work. This is the work of the future. It's not like this frivolous activity. Like this is the work of our times. To really start paying attention to the quality of attention and intention that we bring to any situation, and to get really clear on which mindset, which operating system we're working from. Again, these are like, just think about this as a thing that we're looking at, and I'm just trying to give you different angles to be looking at it from. So this is another angle view of these 2 operating systems. But you know, in the past, we've really seen ourselves as separate from lives. Hang on. It's like a stance of detachment, this scientific method where, oh, we're this objective observer and we're studying reality and we're so separate from it. And when we're separate from it, like we put ourselves on the bleachers, we're bystanders, and like life is happening around us and we're just on the bleachers watching it go by. And self-leadership is about becoming conscious of the micro moments in daily life when we actually get to choose if we want to continue from this stance, or if we want to recognize, actually, no, we are players, key players in this game. And we're actually part of life. We're part of what's going on. Otto talks, you know, he puts source as the bottom of the iceberg because, and I see why, I mean, to me, this is why, so let me just say, this is why, I don't know if this is why Otto did it, but this is why I think it makes so much sense to me is, you know, we've been, let me just name this, we have been educated and socialized to believe we are separate, to believe that like life is scarce, and we're powerless to do anything around it. And when you believe that, you start to see the world from that way. And when you see that world, I mean, life is full, and if you're seeing just aspect, I mean, and there's a note of truth, like there is scarcity in our world and there is separation in our worlds, but I don't think it's the full picture. But if you just see it from that sliver of reality, then you act from that sliver of reality, and you're going to get results from that sliver of reality, which is going to reinforce that belief. So this is a self-reinforcing cycle. And like, if you start to step into self-leadership and say, all right, maybe what I've been given isn't really all of reality, it's part of reality, but not all of it. And maybe, you know, that it's actually interconnection, and that there's actually a huge abundance. I mean, just look with information, like, wow, there's a huge abundance of it. And that we actually have power and courage to change it, sorry. And when we believe that, we start to see like our perception slightly shifts, and the actions that we see as possibilities slightly shifts, and the results might continue to reinforce this belief in a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating way. This is a quote from Stephanie Nesselrode, who's a member of SOFA, but she points out that every micro decision we make creates the person we will become, who is then the person who will make the decision from then on. So like our little decisions really set us on a trajectory, and it's going to be the little decisions that can move us towards a different trajectory. All right, going back to the third thing, we've been alluding to the 2 operating systems, but like, let's get into the nitty-gritty details of these 2 operating systems. So let me just say, and I told you, I've come in through theory, like there's a zillion people who are talking about these two operating systems, but we're using very different languages. So I'm gonna just hold up, and there's many more. And if you're somebody who's like, oh, I know more labels, let me know, because I'm just kind of aggregating what are the different labels. But you know, Otto Schwarmer calls it ecosystem, yang, yin, to kind of refer to there's a masculine and a feminine to this. There's head-centered and heart-centered, the mechanistic lens or the living system lens, and also the left brain and the right brain. And I'll just say my curiosity was really piqued by looking at this through brain hemispheres. It was just a way to kind of take something that was abstract and with the potential for kind of shame and blame, like what's wrong with me or what's wrong with you, and to be like, oh, it's actually just our brains. Look at that. So I'm going to show you this from the lens of the left brain, right brain. I'm going to just name, there's going to be resources. There's 2 quick videos that if this is interesting to you, you could learn a lot more. But this is from the guy, Ian McGilchrist, who he wrote the book, The Master and His Emissary, but it's the divided brain and the making of the Western world. So it's really interesting. He's pointing out that the world that we've created looks a lot like the left brain. So let's look at the left and right hemispheres for a second. These are the qualities of the left brain and right brain. I'm going to let you go through them. I don't really want to read them out loud to you. But understanding these different aspects as actual functions of our hemispheres helps me understand the evolutionary relevance of these 2 distinct systems. So this isn't about replacing the right with replacing the left with the right. It's about a both and. So let's just understand that humans have evolved as hunters and gatherers. So if you look at the left-hand column, the left brain is very well suited for hunting. Think about hunting for a while. Like, it requires detachment. You don't want to be like, oh, what a cute little deer. Like, you need it to be detached and be like, I need to get this. And so you needed to have the single-minded focus on detail, and you needed to have decisiveness and quick action. Whereas the right brain, this whole column over here, is very suited for thinking in wholes and relationality. The gatherers were the people who were tending kids while gathering the plants. So it's a very nurturing energy, and it's a very both ends. Like, I'm watching kids and I'm doing this. So I can do details and I can do the whole. And it has a sense of the whole picture. Just to name, hunters tended to be men. So this is often considered masculine traits, whereas women tended to be the gatherers, and these were the feminine traits. Let me just move on. But let me just say, each of us, even though they're considered feminine and masculine, all those aspects are within us. And just one more thing to look at, as you look through this list, you may notice that this is the skill set that we were educated and socialized to hone. We've perfected this. And it's suited for a world where we're trying to maintain order through control. And that this right-hand column, when you start to understand what works in VUCA, it's not that you don't want to think in VUCA, but you want to be thinking and feeling. You want to be doing and being. You want to be directive, and you want to have more participatory things. And you want to conquer certain aspects of things, but we also want to be caring for. So we want to have the full range of our humanity online is really what I'm trying to say. Okay. So understanding the 2 systems enables us to be in choice around which we choose to operate from, given on the context. So this is a matching of what's going on outside me, knowing that I have 2 different systems I can be pulling from, and what's needed in the moment. Do I need to be fierce and stand up for something I care about, or do I need to be gentle and caring right now? So that's but that's that holistic picture. You can only figure that out when all these things are online. And it enables you to steer. I have Chris Corrigan from The Art of Hosting, is one of my mentors, and he says that you can steer in complexity by stories you want more of, like what do you want to amplify, and stories you want less of, what do you want to dampen. And so just knowing these two different ways of being, it, like, just think about steering in your life and what do you want to see more of and what do you want to see less of within yourself and within the world. Okay, here's the thing. This is the final thing. I'm wrapping this up, but if you guys walk away with one thing, this is it. It's not just understanding the two systems and the full range of your capacity that will be empowering, but the thing to watch for is the relationship between them. And let me just say this, and in the resource, there's a Sarah Payton video. Watch it if you're interested in learning more. But the hemispheres, you need to understand, like, what is the right relationship? What's the most effective relationship between the hemispheres? The left brain, remember, this is the one that says, I'm separate, things are scarce, there's not enough, it's either you or it's me. So if this is privileged, it will kick the right brain offline. But and let me just, and Ian McGilchrist talks about, like, if you could look at this with inside you, but you could also look at this in the world, that we've created a left brain world. So the very, it creates a hall of mirrors effect. He talks about that something different is actually, innovation is actually going to come from the right side of our humanity, from the right side of humanity in society and within ourselves. But the left brain dismisses it. Like, if anyone has experienced the immunity to change, where you're trying to do innovation and you're getting slapped down, this is the phenomena of it. And the thing, and both Bernadette and Greg have really got me to see that you can't talk about this new way of being to people. You have to let them experience it. Like, you can't talk to the left brain about this. You've got to give experiences so that the left brain can start to experience this. Because what happens when the right brain is privileged, this is the one that holds and cares for it. You'll see in Sarah's video, it actually soothes. When the left brain gets anxious about the world and all that's going on, you actually need the right brain on to soothe it. Most of us are hovering, like, you're all here in Sociocracy, and my guess is you're hovering around other, what I consider to be transformational technologies. And I just want to give a nod to how to understand these different things operating across different domains, but they're actually, you're coming to them, I think, for a certain reason. Okay, so this is, as we head into VUCA conditions, we want to take all elements online. So, and it's really about restoring wholeness in ourselves. Like, we've really become left brain dominant people. So how do we restore wholeness within ourselves? And so we actually need to evolve deep technologies of transformation. If you think about how people create structures, and then structures create us, you know, they can really hold us in place. So 98% of what we are getting, unless you're looking intentionally for alternatives, 98%, and this is my hypothesis, I don't know, but it's more of what is. So if you want to start developing differently, you need to put yourself in structures that can lead you to become different, to grow and help you develop to be different. So many of us are fascinated by these methodologies. And hang on, I'm missing it, hang on. Anyway, these technologies actually are kata, and this is Francois Nukel, who's also a SOPA member, but he lived in Japan, and he talked about how all these practices of these different methodologies, including sociocracy, they really help us learn the little skills to be different people, to be more whole people. And he points out that they're interpersonal, that they're often best when we learn them with others, that they integrate, they weave the mind, body, and the soul. They're embodied. You can't read about these. You can only really get these by learning and doing. So the analogy that I have is like a dojo, like find some dojos where you can practice with people. And the last thing to note about the transformative qualities of them is they're expanding as you expand into the practice. Like, the practice expands you, and then you go back into the practice and it changes you. So it's like this ongoing spiral of coevolution. And just to note, a lot of us are tracking. I see, you know, our ancestors steered in VUCA conditions by looking at the stars. And so to me, these are the stars. You know, they're the medicine, like medicinal plants that are helping us, or they're the plants to, and so just noticing that they're across domains, but they're working from the same paradigm. So it's just a nod to the importance of many of the things that I think you guys are probably already in. And with that, I'm complete, Bernadette. But I'm going to keep going. Oh, the last thing I want to say is most of them, like what do they have in common? And I don't know for sure, but these are the principles that, you know, studying them that we're kind of extracting, but they all act with consciousness and care for the whole. They empower. They're not about doing 2 or 4. They are integrating the mind, body, and soul. They're all about experimentation and enjoying.